Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Chapter 7. The Sorting Hat. The door swung open at once. A tall, black-haired witch in emerald green robes stood there. She had a very stern face, and Harry's first thought that this was not someone to cross. "The first years, Professor McGonagall," said Hagrid. "Thank you, Hagrid. I will take them from here." She poured the door wide open. The entrance hall was so big that you could have fitted the whole of the Dursleys' house in it. The stone walls were lit with flaming torches like the ones at Gringotts. The ceiling was too high to make out, and a magnificent marble staircase facing them led to the upper floors. They followed Professor McGonagall across the flagstone floor. Harry could hear the drone of hundreds of voices from the doorway to the right. The rest of the school must have already been here, but Professor McGonagall showed the first years into a small, empty chamber off the hall. They crowded in, standing rather close together than they usually would have done, peering about nervously. "Welcome to Hogwarts," said Professor McGonagall. "The start of term banquet will begin shortly. But before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you will be sorted into your house. The sorting is a very important ceremony, because while you are here, your house will be something like your family within Hogwarts. You will have classes with the rest of your house, sleep in the dormitory, and spend your free time in the common room. The 4 houses are called Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Each house has its own noble history and has produced outstanding witches and wizards. While you are at Hogwarts, your triumph will earn you house points, while any rule breaking will lose house points. At the end of the year, the house will have the most points is awarded the House Cup, a great honor. I hope each of you will be a credit to whichever house becomes yours. The sorting ceremony will take place in a few minutes in front of the rest of the school. I suggest you all smarten yourselves up as much as you can while you are waiting." Her eyes lingered for a moment on Neville's cloak, which had fastened under his left ear, and on Ron's smug nose. Harry nervously tried to flatten his hair. "I shall return to get you when we are ready," said Professor McGonagall. "Please wait quietly." She left the chamber. Harry swallowed. "How exactly do they sort us into the houses?" he asked Ron. "Some sort of test, I think. Fred said it hurts a lot, but I think he was joking." Harry's heart gave a horrible jolt. A test in front of the whole school? But he didn't even know any magic yet. What on earth would he do? He hadn't expected anything like this the moment they arrived. He looked around anxiously and saw that everyone else looking terrified too. No one was talking much except Hermione Granger, who was whispering very fast about all the spells she had learned and wondering which one she'd need. Harry tried hard not to listen to her. He had never been more nervous. Never, not even when he'd had to take a school report home to the Dursleys, that saying he somehow turned the teacher's wig blue. He kept his eyes fixed on the door. Any second now, Professor McGonagall would come back and lead him to his dorm. Then something happened which made him jump, about a foot in the air. Several people behind them screamed. "What the?" he gasped. So did the people around him. About 20 ghosts had just streamed through the black wall, pearly white and slightly transparent. They glided across the room, talking to each other and hardly glancing at the first years. They seemed to be arguing. What looked like a fat little monk was saying, "Forgive me and forget. I say, we ought to give them a second chance. My dear Friar, we haven't given Peeves all the chances he deserves. He gives us all bad name, and you know he's not really even a ghost. I say, what are you all doing here?" A ghost wearing ruff and tights had suddenly noticed the first years. Nobody answered. "New students," said the fat fear, smiling around them. "About to be sorted, I suppose." A few people nodded mutely. "Hope to see you in Hufflepuff," said the friar. "My old house, you know." "Move along now," said a sharp voice. "The sorting ceremony is about to start." Professor McGonagall had returned. One by one, the ghosts floated away to the opposite wall. "Now form a line," Professor McGonagall turned the first years, "and follow me." Feeling oddly as though his legs had turned to lead, Harry got in line behind a boy with sandy hair, with Ron behind him, and they walked out of the chamber, back across the hall, and through a great pair of double doors into the great hall. Harry had never even imagined a place, such a strange and splendid place. It was lit by thousands and thousands of candles, which were floating in midair over 4 long tables, where the rest of the students were sitting. These tables were laid with glittering golden plates and goblets. At the top of the hall there was another long table where the teachers were sitting. Professor McGonagall led the first years up here so that they came to a halt in the line. Facing the other students with the teachers behind him, The hundreds of faces staring at them looked like pale lanterns in the flickering candlelight. Dotted here and among the students, the ghost shone misty silver. Mainly to avoid all the staring eyes, Harry looked upwards and saw a velvety black ceiling dotted with stars. He heard Hermione whisper, "It's bewitched to look like the sky outside. I read about it in Hogwarts, a history." It was hard to believe that there was a ceiling there at all, and the great hall didn't simply open to the heavens. Harry quickly looked down again as he saw Professor McGonagall silently place out a four-legged stool in front of the first years. On top of this stool, she pointed a wizard's hat. This hat was patched and frayed and extremely dirty. Aunt Petunia would not have let it in the house. Maybe they had to try to get a rabbit out of it, Harry thought wildly. That seemed the sort of thing. Noticing that everyone in the hall was now staring at the hat, he stared at it too. For a few seconds there was complete silence. Then the hat twitched. A rip near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. "Oh, you may think I'm pretty, but you can't judge what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. If you can keep your ballers back, your top hat sleek and tall, for Hogwarts sorting hat, and I can cap them all. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see. So try me yon, and I will tell you where you ought to be. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. The daring nerve and chivalry set the Gryffindors apart. You may belong in Hufflepuff, where you are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true, unafraid, and toil. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've already mind. Where those of wit and learning will always find their mind. Or perhaps in Slytherin, where you'll make real friends. Those cunning folk who use any means to achieve their ends. So put me on, don't be afraid, and give it in a flap. You're in safe fans, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap." The whole hall burst in applause at the hat. It bowed to each of the four tables, and then became quiet and still again. "So we've got to just try on the hat?" Ron whispered to Harry. "I'll kill Fred." He was going on and wrestling a troll. Harry smiled weakly. Yes, trying on the hat was a lot better than having to do a spell, but he did wish they could have tried it on without everybody watching. The hat seemed to be asking rather a lot. Harry didn't feel brave or quick-witted of any of it. If only the hat had mentioned a house for people that felt queasy, that would have been the one for him. Professor McGonagall now stepped forward, holding a long roll of parchment. "When I call your name, you will put it on, and the hat will sit on the stool and be sorted," she said. "Abbot Hannah." A pink-faced girl with blonde pigtails stumbled out of line, put the hat on, which fell right under her eyes. She sat down for a moment's pause. "Hufflepuff!" shouted the hat. The table on the right cheered and clapped as Hannah went to sit down at the Hufflepuff table. Harry saw a ghost of fat fear waving merrily at her. "Bones, Susan!" "Hufflepuff!" the hat shouted again, and then Susan scuffled off to sit next to Hannah. "Boot, Terry!" "Ravenclaw!" The table second from the left clapped. This time, several Ravenclaws stood up to shake hands with Terry as he joined them. Broccolist, Mandy, went to Ravenclaw, too. Brown Lavender became the first new Gryffindor at the table on the far left. It exploded with cheers. Harry could see Ron's twin brother catcalling, "Brewster Millicent," and then became a Slytherin. Perhaps it was Harry's imagination. After all, he'd heard about Slytherin. But he thought they looked like an unpleasant lot. He was starting to feel definitely sick now. He remembered being picked for teams during sports lessons at his old school. He had always been the last one chosen. Not because he was no good, because no one wanted Dudley to think they liked him. Finch Flessley, Justin. Hufflepuff. Sometimes Harry noticed the hat shouted the house at once, but others it took a little while to decide. Finnegan, Seamus. The sandy-haired boy next to Harry in line sat on the stool for almost a whole minute before the hat declared him Gryffindor. Granger, Hermione. Hermione almost ran to the stool and jammed the hat eagerly on her own head. Gryffindor, shouted the hat. Ron groaned. A horrible thought struck Harry, as horrible thoughts always do when you're very nervous. What if he wasn't chosen at all? What if he just sat there with the hat over his eyes for ages, until Professor McGonagall jerked it off his head, and said that there had obviously been a mistake and he'd better get back on the train. When Neville Longbottom, the boy who kept losing his toad, was called, he fell over on his way to the stool. The hat took a long time to decide with Neville, when finally it shouted, "Gryffindor!" Neville ran off still wearing it, and had to jog back amid glales of laughter to give it to McDowd Morag. Malfoy swaggered forward when his name was called, and he got his wish at once. The hat had barely touched his head when it screamed, "Slytherin!" Malfoy went to join his friends, Crabbe and Goyle, looking pleased with himself. There weren't many people left now. Moon, Knott, Parkinson, and then a pair of twin girls, Patel and Patel. Then Perks, Sally Ann, and then at last, Potter, Harry. As Harry stepped forward, whispers suddenly broke out like a hissing fire all over the hall. "Potter, did she say the Harry Potter?" The last thing Harry saw before the hat dropped over his eyes was a hall full of people craning to get a good look at him. Next second he was looking back inside of the hat. He waited. A small voice said in his ear. "Difficult. Very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind, either. There's talent, oh my goodness, yes. And a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting. So where should I put you?" Harry gripped the edges of the stool and thought, "Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin, eh?" The small voice said, "Are you sure? You could be great. You know, it's all here in your head, and Slytherin will help you on the way to greatness. No doubt about that. No? Well, if you're not sure, better be Gryffindor." Harry heard the hat shout the last word at the whole hall. He took off the hat and walked shakily towards the Gryffindor table. He was so relieved that he had been chosen and not put in Slytherin, he had hardly noticed he was getting the loudest cheer yet. Percy, the prefect, got up and shook his hand vigorously, while the Weasley twins yelled out, "We got Potter! We got Potter!" Harry sat down opposite the ghost in the rough he'd seen earlier. The ghost patted his arm, giving Harry the sudden, horrible feeling he just plunged into a bucket of ice-cold water. He could see the high table properly now. At the end nearest him sat Hagrid, who caught his eye and gave him the thumbs up. Harry grinned back, and there, the entire center of the high table, in a large gold chair, sat Albus Dumbledore. Harry recognized him at once from the card he'd got out of the chocolate frog on the train. Dumbledore's silver hair was the only thing in the whole hall that shone as brightly as the ghost's. Harry spotted Professor Quirrell, too. The nervous young man from the leaky cauldron. He was looking very peculiar in a large purple turban, and now there were only 3 people left to be sorted. Turpin Lisa became Ravenclaw, and then it was Ron's turn. He was pale green by now. Harry crossed his fingers under the table, and a second later the hat shouted, "Gryffindor!" Harry clapped loudly with the rest as Ron collapsed into the chair next to him. "Well done, Ron! Excellent!" said Percy Weasley, promptly across the hall. Harry, as Zebini's Blaze was pronounced a Slytherin. Professor McGonagall rolled up her scroll and took the sorting hat away. Harry looked down at his empty gold plate. He had only just realized how hungry he was. The pumpkin pasties seemed ages ago. Albus Dumbledore had gotten to his feet. He was beaming at the students, his arms open wide, as if nothing could have pleased him more than to see them all there. "Welcome," he said. "Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts. Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words. And here they are. Nitwit, Blubber, Oddment, and Tweak. Thank you." He sat back down. Everybody clapped and cheered. Harry didn't know whether to laugh or not. "Is he a bit mad?" he asked Percy uncertainly. "Mad," said Percy airily. "He's a genius, best wizard in the world." "But he is a bit mad. Yes, potatoes, Harry?" His mouth fell open. The dishes in front of him were now piled with food. He had never seen so many things he'd like to eat on one table. Roast beef, roast chicken, pork chops and lamb chops, sausages, bacon and steak, boiled potatoes, roast potatoes, chips, Yorkshire pudding, peas, carrots, gravy, ketchup, and for some strange reason, mint huggins. The Dursleys had never exactly starved Harry, but he'd never been able to eat as much as he liked. Dudley had always taken anything that Harry really wanted, even if it made him sick. Harry piled this plate with a bit of everything, except for the hamburgers, and began to eat. It was delicious. That does look good, said the ghost. The rough said sadly, watching Harry cut up his steak. Can't you... I haven't eaten for nearly 500 years, said the ghost. I don't need to, of course, but one does miss it. I don't think I've introduced myself. Sir Nicholas de Missy Propatin, at your service, resident ghost of the Gryffindor Tower. I know who you are, Ron said suddenly. My brothers told me about you. You're nearly Headless Nick. I would prefer if you call me Sir Nicholas de Missy. The ghost began stiffly, but sandy-haired Seamus Finnegan interrupted. Nearly headless? How can you be nearly headless? Sir Nicholas looked extremely miffled, as if their little chat wasn't going the way he wanted. Like this, he said irritably. He seized his left ear and pulled. The whole head swung off his neck and fell onto its shoulder as if it was on a hinge. Someone had obviously tried to behead him, but not done it properly. Looking pleased at the stunned looks on their faces, nearly headless Nick flopped his head back onto his neck, coughed, and said, So, new Gryffindors, I hope you're going to help us win the house championship this year. Gryffindor has never gone so long without winning. Slytherin has got the cup 6 years in a row. The Bloody Baron's becoming almost unbearable. He's a Slytherin ghost. Harry looked over at the Slytherin table and saw a horrible ghost sitting there, with black staring eyes, a gaunt face, and robes stained with silver blood. He was right next to Malfoy, who, Harry was pleased to see, did not look too pleased with the seating arrangements. How did he get covered in blood? Asked Seamus, with great interest. I never asked, said nearly headless Nick. When everyone had as much as eaten all that they could, the remains of the food faded from the plates, leaving them sparkly clean as before. A moment later, the pudding appeared. Blocks of ice cream in every flavor you could think of. Apple pies, treacle tarts, chocolate eclairs, and jam donuts. Trifle, strawberry, jelly, and rice pudding. As Harry helped himself to a treacle tart, the talk turned to their families. I'm half and half, said Seamus. Me dad's a muggle. Mom didn't tell him she was a witch till after they were married, but a nasty shock for him. The others laughed. What about you, Neville? Said Ron. Well, my gran brought me up, and she's a witch, said Neville. But the family thought I was a muggle for ages. My great-uncle Archie kept trying to catch me off my guard and force some magic out of me. He pushed me off the edge of the Blackpool Pier once. I nearly drowned, but nothing happened till I was 8. Great-uncle Angie came around for some tea, and he was hanging out with me upstairs by the window. By the ankles, my great-uncle Evan offered him a meringue and then accidentally let go, but I bounced all the way down the garden into the road. They were all really pleased. Gran was crying. She was so happy. And all you should have seen their faces when I got in here. They thought I might not be magic enough to come, you see. Great-uncle Algie was so pleased that he bought me my own toad. On Harry's other side, Percy Weasley and Hermione were talking about lessons. I'd hoped that they'd start straight away. There's so much to learn. I'm practically interested in transfiguration, you know. Turning something into something else. Of course, it's supposed to be very difficult. You'll be starting small, just matches, into needles, and then that sort of thing. Harry, who was starting to feel warm and sleepy, looked up at the high table again. Hagrid was drinking deeply from his goblet. Professor McGonagall was talking to Professor Dumbledore. Professor Quirrell, in his absurd turban, was talking to a teacher with greasy black hair, a hooked nose, and shallow skin. It happened very suddenly. The hook-nosed teacher looked past Quirrell's turban straight into Harry's eyes, and a sharp, hot pain shot across the scar on Harry's forehead. Ouch! Harry clapped a hand onto his head. What is it? Asked Percy. Nothing. The pain had gone as quickly as it escaped. Harder to shake off was the feeling that Harry's got from the teacher's look, a feeling which he didn't like Harry at all. Who's that teacher talking to Professor Quirrell? He asked Percy. Oh, you know Quirrell already, do you? No wonder he's looking at you so nervous. As Professor Snape, he teaches potions, but he doesn't want to. Everyone knows he's after Quirrell's job. Knows an awful lot about the dark arts, Snape. Harry watched Snape for a while, but Snape didn't look at him again. At last, the puddings too disappeared, and Professor Dumbledore got to his feet again. The great hall fell silent. Ahem. Just a few more words, and now we're all fed and watered. I have a few start-of-term notices to give you. First, you should note that the force in the grounds is forbidden to all pupils, and a few of our older students would like well to remember that as well. Dumbledore's twinkling eyes flashed in the directions of the Weasley twins. I have also been asked by Mr. Filch, the caretaker, to remind you all that no magic should be used between classes and the corridors. Quidditch trials will be held in the second week of term. Anyone interested playing for their house team should contact Madam Hooch. And finally, I must tell you that this year, the third floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to anyone who does not wish to die a very painful death. Harry laughed, but he was one of the few who did. He's not serious, he muttered to Percy. Must be, said Percy, frowning at Dumbledore. It's odd, because he usually gives us a reason we're not allowed to go somewhere. The forest is full of dangerous beasts, everyone knows that. I don't think he would have told us prefects, at least. And now, before we go to bed, let us sing the school song, cried Dumbledore. Harry noticed that the other teachers' smiles had become rather fixed. Dumbledore gave his wand a little flick, as if he was trying to get a fly off the end of a long golden ribbon, which rose high above onto the table and twisted like a snake into words. Everyone pick up their favorite tune, said Dumbledore, and off we go. The school bellows, Hogwarts, Hogwarts, Hoggy Warty Hogwarts, teach us something please, whether we are odd and bald or young with scabby knees. Our heads could do with filling with some interesting stuff, for now they're bare and full of air, dead flies and bits of fluff. So teach us things worth knowing, bring back what we forgot, just do your best, we'll do the rest, and learn until our banes all rot. Everyone finished the songs at different times, and at last the Weasley twins were left singing along to a very slow funeral march. Dumbledore conducted their last few lines with his wand, and then they had finished. He was one of those who laughed the loudest. Ah, music, he said, wiping his eyes. A magic beyond all we do here. And now, bedtime. Off. The Gryffindor first years followed Percy up to the chattering crowds, out of the great hall, and up the marble staircase. Harry's legs were like lead again, but only because he was so tired and full of food. He was too sleepy to even be surprised that the people in the portraits along the corridors whispered and pointed as they passed, or that twice Percy led them through the doorways behind the sliding panels and hanging trapezies. They climbed more staircases, yawning and dragging their feet, and Harry was just wondering how much further they had to go before they came to a sudden halt. A bundle of walking sticks was floating in mid-air ahead of them as Percy took a step towards them and started throwing themselves at them. Peeves, Percy whispered. A poltergeist. He raised his voice. Peeves, show yourself. A loud, rude sound, like air being let out of a balloon, answered. Do you want me to go to the Bloody Baron? There was a pop, and a little man with wicked dark eyes and a wide mouth appeared, floating cross-legged in the air, clutching the walking sticks. Ooh, he said with an evil cackle. Ickle feasties! What fun! He swooped down suddenly at them, all ducked. Go away, Peeves, or the Baron will hear about this. I mean it, barked Percy. Peeves stuck out his tongue and vanished, dropping his walking sticks on Neville's head. They heard zooming away, rattling coats of armor as he passed. You want to watch out for Peeves, said Percy as he began again. The Bloody Baron's the only one who can control him. He won't even listen to us prefects. Here we are. At the end of the corridor hung a portrait of a very fat woman in pink silk dress. Password, she said. Caput Drenkus, said Percy, and the portrait swung open to reveal a round hole in the wall. They all scrambled through it. Neville needed a leg up. He found themselves in the Gryffindor common room, a cozy, round room full of squashy armchairs. Percy directed the girls through the door to their dormitory, and the boys through another. At the top of a spiral staircase, they were obviously in one of the towers. They fed their bads at last. 5 4-posters hung with deep red velvet curtains. Their trunks had already been brought up. Too tired to talk much, they pulled on their pajamas and fell into bed. Great food, isn't it? Ron muddled to Harry through the haggings. Get off, Scabbers. He's chewing my sheets. Harry was going to ask Ron if he'd had a treacle tart, but he fell asleep almost at once. Perhaps Harry had eaten a bit too much, because he had a very strange dream. He was wearing Professor Quirrell's turban, which kept talking to him, telling him he must transfer to Slytherin at once, because it was his destiny. Harry told the turban he didn't want to be in Slytherin. It got heavier and heavier. He tried to pull it off, but it tightened painfully, and there was Malfoy laughing at him as he struggled with it. Then Malfoy turned into the hook-nosed teacher Snape, whose laugh became high and cold. There was a burst of green light, and Harry woke, sweating and shaking. He rolled over and fell asleep again, and when he woke the next day, he did not remember the dream at all.